What up, nerds? Welcome to the channel. My name is Cads. Topic of conversation is the Summit ALTO TR1. It's a one-person dual-wall, semi-freestanding tent that I've had the opportunity now to take on multiple backpacking trips throughout the spring season. How did this tent hold up? Will I be using it for this summer season and beyond? And is this the right tent for you? That and more coming up on this offering of gear testing with Cads. The Alto TR1 is a one-person tent that I would classify as much more of a luxury one-person tent experience. Basically, it's the tent for folks that don't mind carrying a little bit more weight for more functionality, specifically more room inside of the internal vestibule, semi-freestanding capabilities, as well as plenty of headroom. Very roomy for a single-person tent. I took this tent out on a few different backpacking trips, and here's what I learned. During the first trip, I started before the snow line and worked my way up into the snow. The idea was to try and backpack as far as I could before nightfall. So I found a spot underneath a tree, set up the tent, and put on the rainfly because it was a heavy humidity night, as well as I wanted to test out that hydrostatic head. More about that here in a minute, but first, let me talk about some of my initial impressions of spending my first night in the Summit ALTO TR1. My initial impression of this tent is that it is exceedingly roomy. I could fit myself, my backpack, all of my gear, including my trekking poles, inside of the tent and not feel claustrophobic. And I would say this is a huge strength. If you're an individual who wants extra room, wants to be able to change inside of your tent or have a space to be able to hang out and not feel that claustrophobic feeling, this tent is a solid option. Real quick editor's note, this particular gear loft does not come standard in the Summit ALTO TR1. This is an additional addition that I added to be able to have extra gear space in the tent itself. It is the top shelf by Gossamer gear. It's super cheap. It weighs next to nothing. I highly recommend it. All right, moving on. Next, let's talk about hydrostatic head. But first, what is hydrostatic head? Hydrostatic head is the global standard unit of measurement for determining how waterproof a material is, and it is measured in units of millimeters. The Alto TR1 has a rating of 1200 millimeters on both the rainfly as well as the bathtub bottom. Tents are rated primarily between 1,000 and 5,000 millimeters, with 1,000 meaning it can withstand a very light rain, and anything over 5,000 meaning it is a premier material and is completely waterproof. So, for reference, my Z-Packs Duplex L that I did a review video on has a hydrostatic head of over 20,000 millimeters and completely withstood over 5 inches of standing rain, including water that went completely underneath the tent itself. That video is linked below. In my testing, this tent does succumb to water seeping through the material relatively quickly, and you can tell nylon has reached its limit when it starts to droop or sag down. However, and this is a big however, hydrostatic headroom doesn't tell the entire story because even though water penetrated the rainfly, myself and my gear did stay dry. Properly setting up your tent, occasionally tightening up your rainfly, ensuring the vent at the top of the tent is open, and practicing preventative maintenance, like setting the tent on a ground cover, like this ultralight and inexpensive sheet of polycro I used here, are all things you can do to help keep you and your gear dry. As long as you understand the limitations of the material being used and you properly set up your tent, you should have no problem. Now, let's talk about my second backpacking trip. During my second trip, I went to the Tropics for a 4-day backpacking trip with my brother, and we experienced everything from sweltering heat at 97 degrees Fahrenheit to also the most heaviest downpours I've ever seen in my life and heavy humidity. When we found camp, there were a tremendous amount of bugs, everything from scorpions, no joke, to big spiders, the biggest beetles I've ever seen in the world. One of them chased me. It was hilarious, according to my brother. So this tent was the tent of choice for myself when going into the tropics. Another big reason that I decided to take this tent versus a single wall is when weather was good, I wanted to be able to stargaze. So I could either take the rainfly entirely off or keep it halfway on. So I could also promote airflow during really hot parts of the day, air everything out, and if I had to be inside of my tent away from bugs, I wasn't overheating on the inside of my tent. So this was the perfect tent for the trip. And the trip itself, it was fantastic, also uncomfortable. But anyway, tent worked out great for that trip. Woo. So my third trip, I was back in the Alpine Lakes Wilderness, but now that it was later on the season, I could go further than I did before. We were still in snow, hot days, sub-freezing nights. There was no rain in the forecast, and I did want to do some stargazing. For that particular trip, my roommate and I actually ended up doing over 4 to 5 miles of route finding in the snow because we couldn't find the trail, and it required, at least for me, trekking poles. If I would have brought one of my tents that required trekking poles, I would have had to leave my poles behind, and I wouldn't have made it to our final destination. I did have some wet gear, which I left inside of the tent to dry out while we were gone. Dried out perfectly fine, didn't have the rain fly on, and during that night I was able to stargaze, which is exactly what I wanted to do. My sleep system did fine. There was no condensation to speak of at all, and it was really good to be able to test it full on without a rain fly to just see how it worked. Overall, my experience with the SETA Summit ALTO TR1 has been exceedingly positive, but this also doesn't tell the entire story about the tent. Let's talk about packaging and what I do to shave weight from the tent itself, as well as what does semi-freestanding tent mean? Let's begin. Now, normally I wouldn't dive too deeply into the presentation of a tent itself, but SETA Summit has done a couple unique things. The tent is comprised of 3 pieces that connect together. The tent and the rainfly are both in their own stuff sacks, and the tent poles are located inside of a light bar. The idea behind the light bar is that you can attach this into the inside of your tent, throw in a headlamp, and you can diffuse the light. However, I can say that I'm not going to be taking this backpacking. A little bit of weight that I can shave off the top immediately. For me, that's important because I do carry a lot of my camera gear with me, so I'm always looking for ways to lighten the load. The tent itself does come in 2 stuff sacks, a rainfly as well as the tent proper. This is a large stuff sack from Mountain Laurel Designs made of Dyneema. I can put away a wet tent and this won't get the rest of my gear inside of my bag wet. So tent, rainfly, single bag, also the stakes are in here as well. This is everything that I take. This will either go inside of my pack or strapped on top. These go into one of the side pouches, son and done. Next up, what does semi-freestanding tent mean? The tent is comprised of the body and a single tent pole that fully extends out to the toe box and connects down the center of the tent just above your head. In order to expand out the headspace as well as the internal vestibule, you have to stake the tent out. This is what is meant by semi-freestanding. Now, can you use the tent without staking it out? The short answer is yes, and actually I did end up using this in the tropics at Airbnbs specifically to be able to keep myself and my gear away from spiders, centipedes, cockroaches that were at times prevalent in some of the Airbnbs that we stayed in. You can most definitely use this in a semi-freestanding mode during the summertime. You would sacrifice the full scope of the internal vestibule storage and you couldn't use it with rain in the forecast. The other thing that is really important for me from the semi-freestanding standpoint is that all of the shelters that I have, including the Z-Packs Duplex L, the Mountain Laurel Designs Solo Bivy, all of these require trekking poles as the tent poles. So using a freestanding tent, I actually can take my trekking poles with me while I go adventure around and set up a base camp. For example, I've done trips on the coast where during low tide, you need to pass over sections you can't get to unless it's low tide, which means you're going over really slippery, slimy, barnacle-coated rocks where a slip or a fall could be exceedingly dangerous. And so it's either going to be really slow going or you just can't go to those places without the aid of trekking poles. So, who is this tent for? Well, for one, I would say that this tent is for individuals that don't mind carrying a little bit of extra weight for a semi-freestanding one-person tent experience, who might need a little more storage on the inside and also have a lot of headroom on the inside. So if you're in areas where there's a ton of bugs, like mosquitoes or bugs on the ground, you and your gear can stay bug-free and it doesn't feel like you're in this tiny little one-person tent. This tent is also for folks that need their trekking poles while they set up their camp and go adventure further. Lastly, I would say that this would be a perfect tent for folks that are just starting to get into the world of ultralight backpacking. If you're into backpacking at all, you probably already have a freestanding tent before you go to a trekking pole tent. This is a kind of a nice in-between, but it's an excellent way to be able to get into the world of ultralight backpacking without spending upwards of $700 or more for just your shelter. Overall, the SETA Summit ALTO TR1 tent for me has been a perfect addition to my kit, and it most definitely has a spot on my gear rack, and I will be using this throughout the summer and beyond. For more information about this tent, I do have multiple links linked down below, as well as feel free to check out my website. I do have a list of every single piece of ultralight backpacking gear that I use. I also have resources to get you started taking landscape photos of your own and learning the art of landscape photography. As always, thank you folks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.